In a new, exclusive, and revealing interview with Time magazine, Donald Trump answers the question, what would happen if he wins? Time's Eric Cortellessa, who conducted 2 interviews with Trump and spoke with a dozen of his advisors and confidants, writes, Trump thinks he's identified a crucial mistake of his first term. He was too nice. And he goes on to paint this picture of a second Trump term, a deportation operation to remove millions, detention camps, letting red states monitor women's pregnancies, prosecuting abortion ban violators, firing U.S. attorneys who don't carry out his orders, and potential pardons of every one of his supporters accused of attacking the Capitol on January 6th. And joining us now is the author of that timepiece, Eric Cortellessa, along with Democratic strategist Basil Smikle and MSNBC political analyst and Republican strategist Susan Del Percio. Thanks all for joining. Eric, Kellyanne Conway said to you, I don't think it's a big mystery that his agenda would be, but I think people will be surprised at the alacrity with which he will take action. Based on your interviews, is this a Trump who envisions walking back into the White House on day one if he wins and just letting it rip?
Well, there's no question about it, Anna. Donald Trump plans to come into a second term prepared to carry out his agenda unrestrained in a way he was not in the first term. He has the experience from serving in office once before to know how to remove many of the guardrails that stood in his way last time from being able to implement his designs on government. What he's doing right now is he is putting in place a strategic, coordinated plan to seize power in a way that he was unable to in the first term, backed by a slew of advisors and policy groups who are building an infrastructure right now to help him do that and carry it out more effectively in a second term than he was able to in a first.
And so, Eric, when you walked away from that interview, I know you talked to him for more than an hour and then you had a follow-up conversation with him, but what was it that struck you the most about that conversation?
You know, we went into this interview with the mission of writing a story for our readers and the American voting public about what Trump would do with a second term, to tell people in his own words his vision for the nation and what he would do if he were to return to the White House. We felt that was in the interest of the public good. And Donald Trump is a man who, while dodging a number of questions I asked him, really hides in plain sight. He tells you exactly what he's going to do. He's going to carry out a massive deportation operation to try and remove as many or more than 11 million immigrants. He's willing to use the National Guard and even the military, in spite of the Posse Comitatus Act, which says the military can't be deployed on civilians. He's willing to induce local and state police departments to join in that effort through funding initiatives. He says he'd be willing to prosecute a U.S. attorney who doesn't follow his orders to prosecute a specific target. He says on abortion, he is going to make this a states' right issue. He refused to confirm to me that he would veto any kind of federal restrictions on abortion and said that states would have to make their determinations themselves. And that would include, states that decide to monitor women's pregnancies to see if they've gotten an abortion after the ban, or to even prosecute them if they've gotten an abortion after the ban. It also goes in the other direction, right? He says he would allow states to have much more lax abortion laws. So, Donald Trump is a man who tells you exactly what he's going to do, and we wanted to relay what he told me to everybody else.
Susan, there is a lot there, and it's quite a stark picture, right? Is this the America that voters want? Is this what they are going to vote for?
Well, first, I hope everyone reads Eric's piece because it is so enlightening. Donald Trump has always been the most transparent and transactional politician we've ever seen. And so, will he continue down this route? Absolutely. He thinks by saying red states and abortion rights, he could still talk to swing state suburban women. But I think it will take a cumulative effect because everything that Donald Trump has said in this interview, people already know. The question is, come Election Day, will they zero in on it?
But monitoring women's pregnancies, deportation camps, I wonder, what about that, ideological middle, Basil, or the so-called double haters, people who really aren't enthusiastic about either candidate? Does this give them reason to not vote for Trump?
Well, to Susan's point, I think this is a Donald Trump that we all have heard of, we all know. But I would also offer the point that when people tell you who they are, you should believe them. And I think there was in the first go round with Donald Trump, there was this sense of, well, he's just saying it. He doesn't really mean it. He's not going to actualize it. But I think what Eric's piece is saying is that now he has people around him who are more loyal to him than would be in his first term. That were in his first term. He understands the power of government. The guardrails will be off. And even if he's not allowed to employ the military within the United States and American citizens, he can influence paramilitary organizations like police departments. So if you're concerned about the power that he had in the first term, just be very afraid of what he will do if he ever gets a second